Serious, what is the most horrific true story of betrayal, death, or mayhem that has occurred in your community or with someone you know? Shortly after I graduated high school, our yearbooks arrived and had a huge 2-page segment on the Teacher of the Year. In that span between graduation and the yearbook arriving, that teacher had been arrested for the production and distribution of child pornography. I personally never had any contact with him, but I'm sure I know his victims. Just kids going to school trying to fit in at what should be some of the most fun times of their lives, and this sick person stole their innocence and then was honored in the yearbook for Teacher of the Year. 2 streets away from my parents' house in an affluent area, 15-year-old girl got off the bus and walked into her empty house. She didn't know there was a burglar inside. That guy killed her, robbed her, too, and walked away. Before they found the killer, he had texted her parents from the dead daughter's phone for days. That's pretty fricked up to be texting the parents. 2 guys working on an article together. One of them is diagnosed with cancer. While he's going through chemo, the other guy publishes the article under his own name only. It amazes me how some people have no conscience. I've always wondered how people do things like that without the guilt eating them. Sophomore year of high school, 3 years ago, one day before school I just had a feeling that I really wanted to skip and play hooky. I tried, but my mother wasn't having it. During second period I get called out of class and taken to another school where my sister was at. They get us in a room and we find out that my father, who was divorced from my mother and lived an hour away, had snuck in the house while my mother was dropping us off at school. He had strangled her to death. After that he called the police to notify them and then shot himself in the head. Somehow he survived and is now serving a life sentence in prison. One of my colleagues just got prosecuted for having child pornography. I liked him, I counted him as a friend. He'd been to my house and given me small gifts. I only just found out today and still can't really believe it. One of the subjects was a 9-month-old baby. It's just awful. I will never be able to wrap my head around people doing sick stuff like that to babies. I guess it's probably a good thing that I can't. This was over 20 years ago. Our local police officer, small town only one, chased a kid on a dirt bike for riding on the roads and skipping school. The kid tried to turn down a trail and crashed, and the officer hit and killed the kid. The officer was not found at fault, but he left town shortly after. There was a huge debate on whether the pursuit was justified. When I was in the Boy Scouts we were going to have a camp out at a small state park near home. I was sick and couldn't go to it. An overnight thunderstorm knocked down a tree and it landed on a tent and killed my friend. Just bad luck. One tree in the park falls on the night there was a camp out. I still wonder where I would have been sleeping if I wasn't sick. Miss you, Jeremy. You were a funny dude. Had a friend and co-captain of the soccer team brutally murder his parents. Stabbed his dad 20 or so times and chased his mom around the neighborhood with a splitting maul until he caught her. His mom was my English teacher as well. A lady was sexually assaulted from a gang member. She went to report it. The guy had a restraining order. He told his friends to get her. Later the night 3 larger women killed her by beating the crap out of her. Did he not realize that if he was going to murder her the violation of restraining order wouldn't have been a big deal? When I was 6 years old, a guy broke into my neighbor's house and killed my neighbor, a nice, elderly widow, her daughter, and her 5-year-old grandson, who were visiting, with a roofing hammer. Apparently the guy had met my neighbor's late husband in a ham radio club and was, for some reason, convinced there was money hidden in the house. There wasn't. My neighborhood was not a place where violence was a regular occurrence, so it was pretty shocking. The guy was eventually caught because of America's Most Wanted, but I remember seeing reward signs up in all the stores in my hometown before they captured him. Must be terrifying to know what happened next to your house. As I would have locked myself up for decades. When I was in grade 6, a girl in my class was murdered by her own mother to please her boyfriend, who said either her or me. They found her body in the river with her pants pulled down to make it seem like she had been sexually assaulted. She was on TV begging for her daughter to be returned to her after she had already murdered her. My mom worked with the mom at a grocery store and even gave her some of our own money to help. So my scout leader was great. Taught me a lot of useful skills, both practical and life skills. He was a really well-respected member of the community and was awarded Citizen of the Year twice by our council. Turns out he was sexually abusing some of the boys in a couple of the scouting families. He didn't do anything to me. He tried to off himself in prison last I heard of him. Unfortunately, he didn't succeed. The sad part is that his wife still defends him and thinks he's innocent. The evidence was pretty damning, but she's stuck in denial over it all and has alienated herself from everyone because of it. I don't know if it's that horrific, but it did happen a few doors down. A married couple with a daughter had lived in the house, but the wife had taken a lover, subsequently causing them to divorce. The woman stayed in the house, and the lover eventually moved in and became the boyfriend. The scorned ex-husband decided one morning to get revenge. He had been sitting in his car outside, drinking to get courage, before breaking into the house. He had brought his hunting rifle and fired 5 shots into the bed where the ex-wife and her new boyfriend slept. Miraculously, he didn't hit them, and the boyfriend was able to wrestle him outside and scream for help. All this happened around 5 in the morning, so the neighbors woke up and called the police. Incredibly, the daughter had slept through the entire ordeal and didn't get to experience this happening in the house. It sounds like he hadn't used his hunting rifle much. Glad they survived. When I was 13, a friend and neighbor of mine, also 13, was raped and then decapitated by a college student she met the previous weekend. The story made the headline news on Sunday, but we didn't find out who the victim was until they announced it over the school intercom during our SATs a couple days later. It made me kind of numb for a long time, but looking back on it, I can remember vividly every moment of those few days before they found her killer. Fortunately, there were 2, were caught quickly because the news broadcast the sheet her body had been wrapped in. It had an unusual pattern and one of the killer's roommates recognized it. Warning: graphic. This happened in my mother's hometown. A 15-year-old girl was sent to live with her grandma and grandma's sex offender boyfriend. Not too long after, her class was given a writing assignment with the prompt, "What's the best or worst thing that's ever happened to you?" Using fake names in her essay, she described living with a man she was afraid of who had handcuffed and raped her. The school officials followed up with the principal, but the girl got scared and told them she was making it up. No one called the authorities. The grandma and her boyfriend drove her to the school, and she was forced to apologize to the teachers for lying in her essay. After the girl's boyfriend got her pregnant, her grandmother convinced her to get an abortion. The girl eventually called her mother and some pro-life organization filed a restraining order. The mother, who lived in a different state, tried to get custody back and it went to court. The judge spoke with the girl, who told him she was scared of the boyfriend, that he would do inappropriate things, offered her money to strip, and she did not feel safe living there. The judge didn't believe her, never contacted the police, and told the mother that he found no evidence that the home was unsafe. A few months later, he tied her to the bed, raped her, shot her grandmother in front of her, and proceeded to rape her again. They finally believed her. The teachers involved were fired and the judge retired early. Judge should have been tried and convicted of something. This is a story involving the death of my close friend's best friend several years ago. We'll call him Jack. Jack had been partying with his friend John throughout the night until their car wrapped itself around a pole. Both were ejected, since they weren't wearing their seatbelts, and Jack was killed. John was in a coma for several months and has never been the same since. Since both occupants were ejected, the police assumed that the car's owner, Jack, was driving. John's family sued and it was ugly. Jack's family felt something was off and kept the car in storage. A few years later, forensic testing was conducted on the seats and it was determined that John had actually been driving. John maintains that he doesn't remember anything that night. My family lived in a small town of around 15,000 residents. My dad was a local minister at a church program called Celebrate Recovery, which helped people through drug addictions, alcohol, etc., with other fellow pastors. So a few years pass and my family is doing well with the program. And my dad notices something iffy is going in within the church he doesn't know about. He investigates and realizes that one of the leaders are dealing drugs to others inside the church, which is extremely hypocritical. He talks to the main pastor and tells him to kick her out of the group because she is dealing drugs, and they say they will. The next Sunday arrives and my dad goes in to start preaching again. And the same lady that the leader said they will kick out comes in. My dad just stopped what he was doing, told everyone that the lady is dealing drugs, and left the church. Did not come back. Now because it is a small town, rumors spread fast, and the church leaders begin spreading lies about my dad stealing the church donations for himself. Weeks later, the church realizes that it was the leader stealing the tithes all along. We left that city a month later. Well, that wasn't nearly as bad as I thought it would be. Drugs aren't the crime usually associated with churches. A drug addict mom would go online to find guys to sexually abuse her kids while she watched. One night one of these men and his female cousin just out of prison are abusing the 10-year-old girl. They drug her and kill her. In an attempt to discard the body, they dismember her and light her on fire in the bathtub. Some sort of fight breaks out between the adults and the neighbors call the cops and they find the horrifying scene. The whole community was rocked. The monsters who did it are at least off the street and in jail. The poor little girl's name was Victoria Martins. This is sick. Looked through all comments and did not see any of these mentioned. Mikkel Biggs, 11 years old, disappeared. Mesa, Arizona, while waiting for the ice cream man. Her bike with wheels still spinning in 2/4 were found on the ground, but not a trace of her to this day, I believe. That happened around 2 weeks before my daughter was born. Really made me anxious and aware of the nightmarish dangers out there. Spent the whole year being hyper aware of our surroundings and hoping that she was found alive. Still think about that poor kid and her family all the time. Less than a year later, December 1999, a freaking despicable, awful, horrible piece of crap checked his 2-year-old daughter, Kristen Salem, out of daycare, and as I remember told her they were going to see Santa at the mall, drove her to the desert, poured gasoline on her and burnt her alive. Afterwards he went back to the gas station where he bought the gasoline and gas can and told the attendant to call the police because it looked like someone had burned an animal alive. He let them know where it was. I remember hearing his testimony on the news during trial years ago and seem to remember him saying that she was screaming, "Help me daddy, help me," and he laughed. He freaking laughed. I would see the story on the news and just shake out of anger and sadness. We were driving somewhere one day, that same month, and less than a half mile from where we lived there was news trucks from a residential area clogging that street and distracting drivers on the main road. I recognized the woman they were interviewing as the little girl's mother. That profoundly fricked me up. To this day, the poor kid was murdered in the desert miles away, in Mesa, but she apparently lived right there so close to us in Phoenix. I think all that occurring during my kid's first year of life really forged how close we are today. But thinking about either of those cases bothers me to this day. And so many other things have happened in Phoenix before and since then, but those two events will probably never leave my mind. Jesus frick. I need to stop reading this thread. Some people just need to be taken out back and shot. Anyone who would do that to a child, let alone to their own 2-year-old daughter, is not someone who should be living on this earth. Many years ago a friend of ours came to us and said she had witnessed her neighbors abusing their son. We relayed to this person what we had witnessed some stuff too. We agreed it was time to contact the police before this got any worse. My wife and I go to the police and give our statements. As it turns out, social services already had an open file on them, and because of our statements they immediately took the kids from them. When we talked to our friend, she now says I feel too guilty to go to the police. So, while that isn't bad, it is what happened after that makes this horrific. When we gave our statements to the police, the cop told us in no uncertain terms that we would be reported for child abuse because that is a common legal tactic when dealing with adult reporters vice child reporters. Sure enough, within days of them finding out who reported them legal disclosure package, they reported us. Guess who their star witness was? Yup, the friend who got us to report them. Turns out, thank God, that she had told another mutual friend about the abuse she had witnessed with those people and how we were going to report them, and so was she. In the end, we never got in any trouble because it was so obvious what was going on. P.S. Tracy, if you ever read this, IMHO, you are the most horrible person I have ever had a displeasure of meeting. This was super fricked up, especially since nothing ever happened in the tiny town I grew up in. There was a man, a prominent member of the community, former cop, beloved by all, 3 high-achieving kids, who got Huntington's disease. Let's call him Ed. The community totally rallied around Ed, including his best friend Bob, who owned an athletic store in town. Bob had kids the same age as Ed who were best friends. Bob was kind enough to offer Ed's youngest daughter, 14, a job at his athletic store after school. Bob started a local charity run in Ed's honor to raise money for the family's medical bills. Bob was over at Ed's house all the time for dinner and just normal friend stuff. Then it came out. Bob had been filming Ed's daughter in the athletic store. He always recorded her. There were cameras in the changing rooms and he frequently had her try on the clothes to model them or whatever. It gets more fricked up. He had gone over to his best friend's house while nobody was home. They were so close he had the key, and put cameras in all his daughter's bedrooms and bathrooms. Bob had a daughter the same age as Ed's and had put cameras in her bedroom and bathroom too. Just think about that for a minute. He took advantage of his best friend's chronic illness, which was tearing their family apart, to prey on his children. They raided his home and workplace and found thousands of child pornography images and videos. Some he had made himself and others too. He's currently serving 5-9 years, which I don't think is close to enough. Jesus Christ. Someone like that should be serving 25 to life, not 5-9. A 10-year-old girl was raped and murdered in the park across from our home. Our 3-year-old son had played with her in the park. When she turned up missing, we heard people running through all the yards yelling her name. Eventually everyone knew who had done it. It was the boyfriend of her teenage sister. He did it because he thought that she told someone that he stole their shoes. He did steal. She hadn't told. He got a lesser sentence because they said she was technically already dead when he raped her. So it wasn't rape. Added, technically it is still a life sentence. The only difference is he's eligible for parole, but has been denied several times. Our state doesn't have the death penalty, but it enrages me that he was found not guilty of rape, though there's no question he did it. Good God. My aunt's sister was murdered by BTK in 1974. Catherine Bright came home to BTK hidden in her house. Her brother happened to come home too and caught Dennis Rader, BTK, off guard. Brother ended up shot twice in the head and escaped. Catherine died of her wounds in the hospital after many transfusions and surgeries. Despite having a bloody man running down the street screaming for help, the woman rescued before death, and BTK himself frizzled. Tried to steal a car, wrong keys, literally just ran away to his car a half a mile away. The murderer got away and lived a normal. This happened to my aunt. About 4 years ago, she's discovered that her husband, with whom she had been married for 20 years and with whom she had 2 children, had been cheating on her for a long time. When my cousins were little, he made his whole family believe that he had cancer, which was easily faked since he's a doctor himself, while in fact he was just seeing another woman while pretending to need some rest at his private apartment. My aunt was crushed and ended up killing herself by jumping into the nearest river. Since then our family has been broken. We barely see each other, even on holidays. Back when I was in middle school, my brother had a friend whose parents had divorced. One day he gets called to the office in the middle of class to learn that earlier that morning his dad had broken into the house, tied his mom to the bed, set the whole house on fire and just laid down next to her while it burned. Shortly after that the friend and his sister went to live with relatives and switched schools. I still think about it every time I hear Eminem and Rihanna's Love the Way You Lie. Holy crap, that's terrifying. Tale of horrific death and most likely betrayal here. I'm a paramedic at a high crime area. My partner and I were dispatched to a car accident where a car hit a tree. Arrived to find police on scene. The patient was in the car, which was quite far away from the road, and there was a small stream between us and the car. We eventually gain access to the patient, who's sitting in the driver's seat, alive, but not breathing. The weird part was the car barely had a scratch on it, but this guy was basically dead. There were a few cracks in the windshield, but other than that the car looked fine. The airbags didn't even deploy. So we eventually get this guy out of the car and into our ambulance. He ends up going into cardiac arrest in the ambulance as we prepare for transport. As we're doing CPR, A cop pokes his head in and asks if we found any gunshot wounds on the patient. We quickly check the patient, which we were about to do before he went and died on us. Nothing on the front. 2 GSWs on his back. Explains the whole dying thing. We end up doing CPR the whole way to the hospital, and he ends up dying there. After the call, I Google this guy. The first hit is that he's on the sex offender registry for kidnapping. I always try to give people the benefit of the doubt, especially since kidnapping charges can be kind of vague. Could have run a child prostitution ring, or could have taken his kids that he doesn't have custody of out of town for the weekend. You never know. Turns out the proceedings for his case are all online. He and a bunch of other guys were arrested for kidnapping about 15 years ago. They kidnapped a kid and her mom to get money out of the mom's significant other. However, the guy called the police, so they followed the perps to the drop site. The group of guys caught onto this and decided that someone had to shoot the cops. After some deliberation, one of them decided to take one for the team, ended up killing one cop and costing the other his eye. Turns out the guy that was in the car testified against his friends 15 years ago for a lighter sentence. Very interesting. My so's cousin moved in with her boyfriend in London 2-3 years ago. Her body was found dismembered in their apartment not long after that. A man in our neighborhood took his family of 2 kids and wife to Florida, and while they were chilling in their hotel room on upper floor of hotel, he systematically tossed his children off the balcony and then jumped himself in front of the mother. I didn't know them well but would see them walking and going to our CSA garden, and we were friendly. That fricked me up for a while. A girl that grew up in my neighborhood was brutally murdered by a man that lived in her apartment building. He had apparently been stalking her for a while. She was a really kind person and probably just smiled and waved or said hello to that guy, and it created a sick obsession in him that eventually led to her death. She and I were never great friends, but we played together a lot as children. Our lives were in similar places when this all happened. We were the same age, attended all the same schools until college, had a lot of friends in common. Her wedding would have taken place the weekend before my wedding. I often think about what happened to her and how cruel fate was to her. It makes me grateful for everything I have in my life. Whoa, that is an eerily close set of circumstances. You were lucky. A wealthy, well-known man from where I'm from was found guilty of kidnapping, raping and murdering a 7-year-old girl. He grabbed the little girl by force when she was playing in her neighborhood. Her cousin tried to stop this and several family members even got out of the house when they heard the commotion, but it was too late. Later that same night, the body of the girl, the man had tried to use some type of oil to erase any evidence on the girl's body. Apparently the man had received help from its siblings who knew of his tendencies and even tried to defend him by saying he had been under the influence of drugs. Protests across the country began since everything pointed that thanks to his wealthy status he was going to walk away free of charge. A few days ago was his conviction, and I think he got around 50 years of jail time, which some people even have come forward and stated that they think it's unfair. But basically it was a huge deal since rape almost always is ignored, and especially if it's a wealthy person. A son murdered both parents with an axe. The murders were some time apart, and chopped the mother up and hid her in a hole in the basement. His sisters found both parents, and after the mother had been killed they were so ashamed that they refused to let anyone see the crime scene and scrubbed their mother's blood off the floor themselves. One of the sisters still live in the house where it all happened. Not sure if I got the question right, but I have one horrific story of death. In my village there was an old guy who served in the military. He was in the war in the Dolomites and was quite big. He and a few other soldiers were running through their trenches when the enemy suddenly opened fire at them. I don't remember what the trenches were like, but he was the only one who survived. All his companions were shot in the head and died, but lucky he was so tall that he got shot through the throat and survived. Dang, it's not too often one gets to say it's lucky I was shot through the throat. That's crazy. Recently, and not too far from where I live, a lady I went to school with and her husband were killed in the middle of the night by her daughter and 2 of her male friends. Her daughter was 15 or 16, and her friends were maybe 20-21. My dad lives right on a river. About 10 years ago, our neighbors had gotten their son a little rocket thing for his 7th birthday, lit it off, and of course it ends up in the river. It's the beginning of summer, so all the neighbors are outside. We can all hear the mom yelling at the dad to go get it. People always think June is the best time for swimming in the river, but it's really the most dangerous, as this is when the ice caps start melting on the mountains and the water is the coldest. The dad eventually goes in but gets stuck. His head is above water, but it's too cold and he gets hypothermia. They call 911, but are too frantic and don't give any details. Just ask them to send help. It's a small town, so the emergency responders don't have things like scuba gear readily available. When they show up, they see that's what they need and call for more help, which arrives 45 minutes later, but it's too late. DOA. The family tried making human chains, but it was just too cold, and by the time they realized he needed help, he was too cold to move or grab onto something. So a little boy watched his dad slowly die while trying to get his toy on his birthday. This happened in February. About 15-20 minutes from where I live, two girls had the day off from school and were hiking on a historic trail together. They were molested and brutally murdered. One of the girls actually got pictures of a suspicious man, and a short audio has been released from her phone of a male voice saying "down the hill." There is more audio, but many in my community suspect that it is too gruesome to be released to the public. The girls often were murdered in a small town with only 3,000 people. They haven't found the killer yet. I read the story somewhere recently. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.